Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Straver, Mike Palmer along with you. And on today's episode, we're taking a look at the recent report card for our nation's education system, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. Mike, how are you doing?
I am doing well. It's the nation's report card. So I think report cards are somewhat triggering for many of us. Either on good or bad. There's not too many people who are like, yeah, report cards came, and I was like, whatever. There's the people who are like, I love report card day. It's like my favorite day of the year. Other people are like, oh man, report cards. How do you turn letters into other letters? And I hope the folks are in a good mood tonight. So the NAEP has been called the nation's report card, and I think that's an interesting framing for this story, which is, our scores are down a bit versus the last time we got our report card, which was 2 years ago. So I think that's why it got some news, and there were some statements out of the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos. There's a prepared statement that we'll share, which includes the actual results of the NAEP. I'm going to call it the NAEP. There's a diphthong in there, but I'm going to call it NAEP. Dan, is that okay?
Yeah, I'm on board.
Okay. Not to be confused with the NEEP, which would be like the NEEP tide, which I'm not going to talk about. That's something else.
A different show.
Different show. Fun with language. NEEP tide is when the high tide and the low tide are the difference between high and low tide is the least possible. So like lots of times if you have a boat docked, you need a high tide to actually get it out. So like a boat can be neeped in that the high tide doesn't get quite so high. But anyway, Betsy DeVos, the Department of Education, is helping make this national report card zeitgeisty. And I think that's a good reason for us to talk about it. And it also, as we were prepping, Dan, I thought it was interesting to think back to when we covered one of our very early shows when Betsy DeVos was being confirmed. There were conversations about the difference between growth and proficiency, which I think is still relevant to this conversation. So how do you know based on these scores whether students are actually improving, or is this more reflective of how many students are proficient in a particular school or type of school? I think that level of critical analysis is important because I think it's pretty easy to get sloppy with your logic here and start saying, based on this, I personally would disagree with some of the further takes that Betsy DeVos has put out about how, this is what happens when government gets involved in anything, and education is just like that. I think that's a little bit of lazy reasoning. So I think there's a lot for us to dig into on this, and then also just the narrative around the nation's report card. I think is an interesting thing. It's why it's got a decent amount of press within the last few weeks. So we thought it was worth talking about.
Yeah, good point there. I think we talked back on our Varsity Blues most recent episode about why the media picks up on certain things. And when Brandon was here previously talking about education, it was with the Parkland shooting that we talked about. This was a major event that got education on the forefront. And now we've seen a pretty steady drumbeat around education on the front page. You shared with me the Wall Street Journal front page had, again, Varsity Blues on it. And now this story, one, there's a negative here, and the media does at times tend to harp on the more negative aspect of stories. So reading down, math slightly up is the general gist of this report card. 296,000 students, depending on which side of the test, took part in 2019 in this testing. And there were drops in the reading side and analysis therein of why are we not progressing on the reading side, slight gains on the math side. Again, this is 4th and 8th graders who are being tested. on the proficiency. I will point out, according to multiple different sources, the NAEP standards are higher than your typical state-by-state standards when it comes to up here in Massachusetts, the MCAS or the variety of different standardized tests that are testing proficiency at each school level. So that is something to think about as well, of how we're using the NAEP as a standard and how we're testing against other tests. But I do think the DeVos comments, the fact it's being covered makes it a very good topic for us to dive into on multiple levels. But if you look through, Mike, it does seem since 1990, there's pretty good progress, right? So if we take the whole of the data we have, there's been pretty good progress over 30 some odd years. Now, that's a large sample of students. It's a large sample of people moving through these schools, but there has been improvement. If we take the small sample, 2017 to 2019, that's where we see less than stellar increases. It does seem like it's a statistical problem. It's what numbers are we looking at and how are we using them to tell the story we want to tell?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's what's the scoring criteria for our national report card? Like has it changed over that 30-year span too? Like, how do you define what the standards are? There's some interesting conversations about the nature of this assessment versus other assessments, to your point, to say, like, is that a valid way to assess these proficiencies, these competencies, and are the competencies themselves that these tests are measuring, are they the right ones? Should we be looking at reading and math, and should we be testing reading and math in the way that these tests are designed? Those are all really interesting questions. Like, they're not really. It doesn't seem like the top level understanding of this really wants to go much deeper. It's sort of like, let's just stay at that surface level. And that was sort of my point about to go from this data set to then say, and that's why we need more charter schools and frankly, I'm somewhat agnostic about charter schools. I think it's a very complex conversation. It's one that we've been trying to represent both sides, all angles on a really complex idea. But like, to me, this is an example of why I think the statistics and the way you measure things can allow folks to portray something like charter schools as better than they actually are. So like, if you're assessing how many of our fourth graders or eighth graders are at or above grade level, a lot of that is based on who those students are when they walk into your classroom. It's not really based on have they learned anything while they've been with you.
Right.
And in the case of charter schools, I think it's true that there are many students who really thrive in that environment and outperform what would have been their expectations had they not had access. I think that the data generally backs that up. I think the flip side is also true, that by virtue of not providing access to kids who need different kinds of help to grow, get back to the growth versus proficiency idea, when you're measuring something and your report card is just about hitting that criteria, a school that only allows kids who are scoring well on these things will be seen as a great example of an amazing school, when in some ways they've just shown that they have a really good way of getting students in who they know will perform well on this. Which is why, if the school and the nation was more measured on growth, meaning regardless of where you are, top to bottom, are you improving? And it's sort of the one size fits none idea that I like to come back to. Like, teaching reading to someone who's in the bottom quartile is very different from teaching reading to kid in fourth grade who's reading at the 7th or 8th grade level. There's value to being expert and focused on any of those flavors. Same thing for kids in the middle, but generally the way this thing works out is a lot of the energy is going to be focused on the kids just below the proficiency criteria, and how do we push them across so that they're treated as being proficient at or above. If you're already way above, we don't care. And if you're too far to really get to the appropriate proficiency level, we're
Right.
not really going to focus our resources there. And I think that's why a lot of, that's why, like I was joking, that's why we've sort of left behind No Child Left Behind. Um, it's because I think some of the assumptions built into the whole intervention um, were kind of flawed because I don't think we really understood exactly how to get the level of personalization. It's a place where computer adaptive testing is also important, where if you can have like something personalized and longitudinal, can you understand whether the student is growing and are they advancing at the maximum rate for them? Um, I think that level of thinking doesn't translate into easy headlines and things where the national report card would always be it's complicated,
Right.
and people want to know, no, did we pass, did we fail, and it'd be like, do you have 45 minutes because I'm going to walk you through some really interesting charts,
Well, yeah.
you know
But I think that's a large part of I'm gonna forget the lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? That quote, statistics, personal background. I work a lot in fantasy sports, and you can shape the narrative whatever way you want with numbers if
right,
you're being honest. Like you can really make things work whatever way you can. And when you have numbers like this that are a small sample, when you think of how many students are actually in school, 296 against 296,000 against how many students are participating in school each and every day. But I think also to your point about charter schools versus public schools versus homeschool kids, how are we putting them into cohorts? How are we determining what school or what city or what town or what jurisdiction, how we're tracking all those things? And each of these tests are different, right? So we're getting different data sets and we're not necessarily able to compare them as easily as we might here on the show want to get a better understanding of how are we actually doing? How are we
right,
moving things forward?
totally. I mean, and how does this relate to ideas like um, diversity of thought?
Yep.
We've talked about neurodiversity too. Like, there are places where the personalization for each individual can and should be much better than it is, but there are also places where the group process of a very wide-ranging set of approaches, mindsets, neurologies, um, I think that all ultimately leads to better group dynamics and things that are very difficult to assess on a standardized test, but stuff that's increasingly relevant to the jobs of the future. So like, can you collaborate effectively? Like, if you're reading something, can you then facilitate a conversation with your friends about it? Like, can you find if you find something interesting, can you find more stuff of your own sort of initiative too? Like, because another trend that's really interesting, particularly with Gen Z, I think we're going to be try to talk more about this, is like how they watch YouTube
Mm-hmm.
and how they go down that rabbit hole where the algorithm is just sending them the next thing to look at. How do you teach kids to both assess the via like the digital literacy, like what could I learn from this report, and then uh, once I understand the best way to analyze the data and have a critical perspective on it, does that then inform me to the point that I can do something different with that information and I can actually be better? I can sort of grow as a learner in how I engage. Those types of things are more like next level thinking. This is it's sort of like an old school. The fact that it has all that longitudinal data almost has it tethered to like older ideas around uh, competencies, reading and math. Um, Reading and math, they are fundamentals. So like that, I heard that somewhere. At least,
Yep.
but but I think there's what should be included and what shouldn't. Like even in math curriculum, like there's so much controversy now around some of the new math techniques that are out there. There's a big push now into statistics and probability. Um, I've heard sort of the jury's out a bit on calculus, depending on who you talk to. Hashtag team calculus sitting here. I'm a big fan of calculus, but trigonometry, people are like, you don't need trigonometry, and like some of that evolves as the educational philosophy or the philosophy around like how do you teach these concepts, and then also what concepts are most relevant to sort of the evolution of our society that's really accelerating right now. It's a it's an interesting time to be thinking about that because like I always wonder like when we were talking a bit to the Fendersons about the Unlikely film that they just did. The name of the film is Unlikely. The film itself may also be unlikely. I'm not sure, but I think the fact that well, they talked a lot about how the selectivity around these schools do sort of bias the results. That was another front page Wall Street Journal article this week was how the College Board has been selling leads to universities.
Right.
I think 47 cents a lead. And then frequently that's done in a system where the university will then send out to more applicants than they know they can accept, and then also to applicants who they know won't be able to get in, so that they're perceived as more selective, which bumps them up in their rankings. So like, to me, you can manipulate these selection criteria, the metrics. It's almost like the facticity or the truthiness of numbers. So like once you put something out there that has some patina of science because they're numbers, it's like a survey suddenly becomes numbers when it's really just people's opinions and people reporting on how they may behave in the future. It's not a hard number. In the case of these NAEP exams, I think they are, as to the best of my knowledge, and this is the type of thing we were talking about, maybe bringing in other experts around the psychometrics and the assessment design that goes into something like this exam. To the best of my knowledge, they're reliable instruments. They're measuring genuine things, and at a macro level, the trend seems to be moving in a good direction over a longer time horizon. And then we've seen a little bit of dip in our reading scores in the last 2 years. I think that's relevant, and in proper context, that's information that can make us all smarter about how we think about education and educational policy. I think the problem is more that treated as sort of a hallowed fact, settled science that our report card was bad, therefore we should allow for more charter schools, and we should provide less funding to our public school system. We at Kaplan take pride in teaching people how to perform well on critical reasoning exams. Like that's an inference you can't really make from that evidence.
Right.
Or to make that that the leap to that conclusion, there's assumptions that really don't hold within there. That being said, it brings us back to the conversation about charter schools, which also made me think about when we were talking to Robert Pondicio about Success Academy and how the other half learns. You can't deny that there are really remarkable results for some students in those contexts. So this gets back to, our score is like an incomplete. It's our relationship status with
it's a maybe.
Our relationship status with our national report card it's complicated, so it's also frustrating too. I mean, what I do pick up under all of this is just sort of like the frustration of really just about everybody about how we're not really achieving our aspirations around our educational systems, and just sort of this yearning for more in terms of learning across all contexts, but then specifically when our children are involved, there's the hope that I believe the children are our future, Dan. I don't know if you know that.
I was waiting.
I'd get there eventually, but like it is true. Like, and I think there's a lot of, Brandon, coined the whole kid solving idea. We've been seeing that really for quite some time now. And, the, particularly around climate change now, like that's really bubbled back up again. So like they picked up after Parkland, it was school safety. And then now there's, going, the climate change and really try to activate even folks who don't vote yet to become politically active through their right to free speech and to assemble and to do all the things that make a democracy great. That's awesome. Uh, but but that's also paired with this sort of idea that we're not giving them the right uh, educational foundation to help them really solve these problems that we know we're not going to solve for them.
Right.
So like, I think there is an element of frustration that then manifests with like the red team, blue team dynamic that I think ultimately winds up being damaging because the conversation just becomes, you know, the, who can express their outrage in the most creative, expressive, viral way. And it's not really how do we wrestle with these problems and explore different solutions. And that's generally why, for me, it's obviously a funding problem at the end of the day, but the idea that we can be more experimental around different modes to see how the different modes um, drive performance, and then how we measure performance, I think needs to become much more blown out. I mean, you were talking about fantasy sports, like the level of metrics that we get for daily fantasy as an example, or if you're trading stocks, like the level of metrics that we get in those capacities. I've talked a lot about saber learning over the years, but like, why don't we have that around ourselves, but also the rising generations who we're hoping will be equipped with the tools that will solve these massive problems that we may not be able to solve ahead of them.
Yep.
Um, I think it just, I know I get frustrated just because like I feel like it's a solvable problem, but it's so big and so systemic that I think you almost just have to look at it through very like narrow foci uh, to make sure uh, you understand what that actually means and how actionable are any of the insights that you might get from what you're seeing here. And I think in the case of this, um, it seems somewhat cautionary just about reading, really. Like,
Right.
and I think that probably is the most actionable thing. Like, you know, maybe something for us to look into too. Like, what's emerging in the research around reading education, reading curriculum. I know Larry Rudman, who's been on the show in the past. Uh, like there are people like him who spend a ton of time in the research community trying to understand how do we learn how to read, how do kids learn how to read,
Mm-hmm.
how do we teach them, how much of it is also gets back to the social emotional thing too. Like how do we make reading not a chore but a present, like a gift. Uh, I think that's sort of maybe that's the way to get out of the muck and start to think, okay, what does this really say? Charter school is really interesting conversation. We could dig into it and bring in other folks to go there. But I think to look at these results and then to say, I told you so,
Mm-hmm.
the department that I'm responsible for it in terms of the public education is not performing. Therefore, we should fund more private charter experiments. I just find that to be a distractor, and I really don't want to go there. I would rather understand, regardless of how you get your curriculum into your school, at the end of the day, there are teachers across children's lives who are teaching them how to read. There are parents, myself, I have a 10-month-old. How do I teach him how to read? Like, what's the right thing to show them? And then how do I build a love of learning, which in many ways is based on a love of reading, into my kid. And then same thing around math, like there's hope there. And we haven't really done a deeper dive on math education. Um, but it's one of the reasons why I've loved being at Kaplan all these years is like it allows me to stay engaged around math and math education. And, you know, that's somewhat heartening, frankly, like that, you know, there's a lot of concern that we're falling behind on STEM and that our math education is bad. So like the idea that it's basically flat, maybe scooching up a bit, um, that's better than the story around reading. Um, and then that's not even covering just beyond math and reading. What would our national report card be on the other competencies that are relevant, um, in say like K-12 education? Um, I think moving in that direction to me feels like where I'd want to go, and I would recommend to our listeners is we'll be sharing out the link to the initial. It's a quick press release from the Department of Education, and then you can access the reports themselves. If you have some time and you are a critical thinker who wants to go to primary sources, that's what I tried to do a little bit in prep for this show. And then that's where, sadly, I landed on it's complicated.
Right.
Like,
Well, I mean, I think that's the takeaway at times. We need to do more. We need to research more. We need to learn more and really break this down further. I will say there's a good USA Today article about the NAEP as well that I thought made a good point about we're still on theories of why reading is not excelling, like what's happening. And obviously, I think from my point of view, we can all say coming up with a single solution for a country of this size is going to be difficult. I think that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but is honest and true. What I do find interesting in this article from USA Today is they discuss the difference between phonics and fluency, and that maybe at times in elementary schools, those focus actually become combative, and how teachers go about their curriculum and how they go about instructing and teaching the act of reading. And to your point, making it more of a present and more of a, hey, let's enjoy
yeah,
this than having to be a learned thing. You need to do this and we need to move on
right.
is an interesting thought process. And I'll say this just because I found it interesting of what you were saying. In that article, there's a link to another article, as they do for SEO and for clicks. And there's now a belief that parents of young of babies and pre-K should say over a million words to their child throughout those formative years.
Yep.
And there's now a word pedometer app where you can track how many words you're using with your kids. So maybe that's part of the answer.
Christmas is coming, Dan.
But the trending education secret Santa is very minimal in the opportunities for gift giving, but we can figure that out. Nonetheless, I find this stuff fascinating. And from the statistical analysis of it all, how are we applying these statistics? What are we measuring? And then are we asking the question of the why? Why is this happening? And how do we fix it if it needs to be fixed? Or how do we accelerate if we need to move forward faster? And I think you hit on a lot of the key stuff of how do we churn forward? How do we make things better? Not just use this as a way to say, oh, I was right. We need to look in this direction. And that's for anybody, any use case of statistics.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this like just how do we elevate the conversation,
Right.
and while also which I think it all just requires time, So I think you need time to go into this with some depth, on the one hand, and then I also think you need time to kind of take a step back from the what's hot right now and what is zeitgeisty, what is likely to go viral, what is likely to get extra clicks, and like how do you facilitate conversations that are not about that? They're actually long form. They're, it's like, the slow food movement, rather than the fast hot take. How do you allow your take to kind of mature and to be informed by like the discourse you're engaging in? And, I think we're trying to do that here, but we would also love if folks out there have thoughts like where do you go to find the the level of conversation that you think is rewarding. You know, I see a lot of this in academia, but I also do, there's the challenge of translation and practical application of the academic research. And then on the flip side, I think it's probably happening in classrooms, but classrooms can be very isolated places. So like, you know, an interesting way to think about this is like if you're teaching K through 4 or 5 through 8, and how do you find time to, you know, teach math and reading and also like model a love of those things and allow for the diversity of levels within your classroom? How do you find the time to give both ends of the bell curve as well as the chunky middle the time that they all deserve? Those are the real conversations that we'd love to get into. But it's also, you know, we frequently, like, it's like the Venus flytrap, you know, like you got to have the clickbait to kind of get people in. And sadly, like, you know, and I'm trying not to be too political, but it does feel like our Department of Education is almost being intentionally provocative here. And I'm trying real hard not to take the bait. I'm trying to take the bait in that this is a time for us to reflect on these scores and the state of our educational system, particularly as it relates to teaching our kids math and reading. And let's explore from there without necessarily trying to get into the I told you so or this is what this means. Like the conversation about charter schools and some of the problems in public schools, that by no means will be settled. And I think that's just something that we need to continue to grapple with. But I think we also have to resist like going right there right away, just to kind of to engage in the kind of crazy over there. I think it's more like there's some sobering news in these scores, and then what kind of interventions are showing the most progress and can they scale better? And then also how do we support our educators, which I was happy to see the Chicago teacher strike get resolved. But like at the end of the day, that's really, it's parents and you know, K through 8 teachers who really are the voices we should be hearing around how to, you know, where are we now? What are the real problems to solve and how can we get better? I think sadly a lot of it winds up being almost like a political conversation,
Right.
And one that's also quite bureaucratic in nature. When at the end of the day, kids learn to read and they learn to love math, probably by being with someone else who cares about them, who wants to convey love of those things to them, whether it's a teacher, a family member, a friend, a mentor, you know.
Or you could be my daughter, where I don't read at all, and she has already read more books in her life than I ever have. So
Right.
there's that too. Things just work out sometimes in nature.
We didn't even talk about ear reading. You
Right.
know? So like if we were to like translating some of the reading comprehension to listening comprehension, if we want to talk about that, reminds me a little
Absolutely.
bit of like typing versus handwriting, you know, and what are the neurological implications, neurochemical, neurodevelopment, related to those kinds of things. Those are certainly interesting, but I think we're going to leave our audience wanting more, as Ethelbert
Always.
likes to say. Yeah.
I think there's a lot to come back to here, lots of discussion points with data, hopefully to back it up as we go through. And if you have topics related to this or articles that you've seen that you want to share, find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed. Same on Facebook. You can also find more information at trendingineducation.com. We are also on LinkedIn. Love to hear from folks who are over there who would like to appear on the show or just have an opinion on the show. So linkedin.com/trending in education. With all that said, we'll be back each and every week, sometimes twice a week, giving you our views on learning and education right here on Trending in Education.